The atmosphere in the studio was supposed to be light, the kind of polished late-night space where controversy is softened with cue cards and applause signs. But when Meryl Streep sat opposite Jimmy Kimmel on that particular night, dressed in soft grays and minimal makeup, she carried the quiet intensity of a woman who had grown tired of deflection dressed as humor. And though the segment began with the usual scripted banter, mentions of awards, projects, industry gossip, the tone shifted subtly when Kimmel, with his usual grin, asked her a question that was less about curiosity and more about poking the, "First, do you ever think actors go too far trying to be political experts?" The moment landed like a stone in shallow water, and Meryl's smile flickered. Not in anger, but in calculation, the way a person smiles before deciding whether to stay within the frame or tear it open entirely. And what followed was not an outburst, not a meltdown, but a calm, devastating unraveling of the question itself. She spoke with the precision of someone who had waited years for this moment, explaining that artists, especially women, have always been forced to apologize for having opinions, that their work is consumed but their warnings ignored, that to be told now in 2025, in the middle of collapsing democracies and commodified tragedies, to stick to acting is not only absurd, but dangerous. And while Kimmel attempted to pivot, to lighten the mood, to pull back toward his comfort zone of irony and detachment, Meryl leaned in further, asking him directly when comedy became a shield for complicity, when late-night shows stopped challenging power and started entertaining it, and the audience, unsure whether this was part of a rehearsed bit, fell into a tense hush, interrupted only by occasional awkward claps that tried and failed to reset the tone. Producers behind the glass panicked, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment burn, while Kimmel's usual charisma began to falter under the weight of Meryl's steadiness. She cited specific cases of censorship, recounted stories of female performers silenced mid-interview, made reference to how even award show speeches are now pre-vetted by publicists and platform executives, and with each word the distance between her and the format grew, until it became clear she was no longer participating in the show but dismantling it in real time. And finally, when she asked, "What's the price of being palatable, Jimmy? A better sponsor? A few more ad buys?" The air inside the studio collapsed into stunned silence, and Kimmel, trying to maintain control, gestured to cut her off, muttering something about time limits and format, to which Meryl, standing now, replied not with rage but with precision. "There's always time for truth, it's ratings that run out." Her microphone was quietly turned down. A backstage handler approached, and while security didn't forcibly remove her, she was clearly being escorted away before the show could resume its comfortable rhythm, and what was meant to be a night of laughs became the epicenter of a cultural rupture that no PR team could contain. Social media exploded within hours, with leaked studio audio and blurry clips from audience members going viral. Hashtags like Chang Streep Unfiltered, Meryl Speaks, and Late Night Lie trended globally, and suddenly the conversation wasn't just about one actress speaking up, but about decades of suppressed voices, performative media, and the slow erosion of meaningful dialogue beneath corporate entertainment. In the days that followed, celebrities divided into two camps, those who praised Meryl for her boldness, and those who offered vague statements about respecting all perspectives. But the public wasn't confused. They were galvanized. Think, pieces poured out from both sides, some hailing her as a necessary disruptor in a plastic media culture, others accusing her of arrogance, and yet even her critics admitted there was something unshakable about the way she didn't flinch when the system tried to mute her. Kimmel, for his part, avoided direct commentary but appeared noticeably rattled in subsequent episodes, often referencing the incident in half-jokes that didn't land, and while the network issued no official statement, quiet changes were made. Longer interviews, fewer restrictions on guest monologues, and behind the scenes, new guidelines were drafted around what constituted editorial interference, all of which were clearly indirect responses to a moment they never anticipated would spiral into movement. Meanwhile, Meryl kept her distance from the headlines, refusing interviews, declining talk show invitations, and instead reappearing weeks later at a student-run theater collective in New Jersey, where she performed a one-woman reading of Uncensored, letters from blacklisted artists, displaced journalists, and silenced activists, and the footage of her trembling voice reciting the words, "We are not dangerous, we are just inconvenient," went viral in its own right, reigniting the debate and drawing international attention. What began as a heated clash on a late-night stage had now become a cultural audit, and Meryl, far from retreating, leaned into the chaos with the serenity of someone who had seen too much to be afraid of pushback. When asked later by a young journalist why she never once raised her voice during the incident, she replied, "Because I didn't need to. When a woman speaks plainly, the whole room still hears an explosion." And that quote alone ended up on murals, posters, even protest signs and unrelated movements calling for transparency and justice. From that point on, Meryl's name became shorthand for a kind of elegant defiance, invoked whenever anyone dared to speak unscripted in a space designed to suppress discomfort. And though Hollywood continued its endless cycle of premieres and scandals, a quiet revolution had begun in the corners of the industry. Actors requesting unedited interviews, writers walking off projects that required them to self-censor, and audiences, perhaps most surprisingly, rejecting the sanitized scripts of celebrity image management in favor of raw, flawed, honest expression. And at the center of this shift stood a woman who never shouted, never insulted, never stormed out, but who simply refused to let her presence be reduced to performance, and in doing so, reminded an entire generation that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stay seated until they ask you to leave and then stand anyway. In the wake of what the press had come to call the Streep disruption, a strange and undeniable current began to sweep through the cultural landscape. Not a tidal wave of immediate change, but something quieter, more enduring, like the slow melt of ice revealing land that had always been there, simply hidden beneath the performance of neutrality. Meryl Streep, who had once been boxed neatly into labels like Hollywood royalty or national treasure, had now transcended those frames entirely, becoming instead a kind of compass, one that refused to point toward comfort, ratings, or PR, but rather toward truth, even when that truth was wildly inconvenient. Journalists began using her appearance on Kimmel as a case study in journalism courses and media ethics classes, dissecting how a single moment of sustained authenticity had cracked open the illusion of editorial freedom on supposedly unscripted platforms, and everywhere from college campuses to writers' rooms, a new kind of energy pulsed. A hunger for unrehearsed conversations, for uncomfortable but necessary questions, and above all, for voices that refused to ask permission. The late-night industry, long protected by the excuse of satire and humor, found itself under scrutiny not for being funny, but for being safe. Comedians who once wore the badge of rebellion now faced uncomfortable questions about what they refused to touch, what they joked around instead of into, and ratings began to reflect a subtle shift as viewers moved away from polished, tightly segmented performances toward podcasts, live streams, and independent creators who allowed raw truth to exist without being edited into amusement. Networks took note. Several prominent showrunners quietly approached Meryl for private conversations, not to apologize, but to learn, to understand how they might foster space for that kind of moment intentionally rather than fearfully. She agreed to some of these conversations on one condition: nothing would be recorded and nothing would be shared until something real was changed. Some walked away, unable to meet her demand. Others stayed. One late-night producer stepped down publicly, stating in an open letter that he could no longer participate in a system where the risk of real speech outweighed its necessity, and his resignation letter went viral, quoted on protest signs and magazine covers. Meanwhile, Kimmel returned to his show changed, subtly at first, dropping the usual monologue tone for something more grounded, inviting fewer actors on press tours and more people with something to lose. And though some accused him of rebranding, others noted a visible difference in his eyes. A kind of humility that can only be born from public reckoning. As for Meryl, she remained curiously still in the public eye, not retreating but observing, creating, mentoring. She launched an online platform called Spoken Once, a digital archive of first-person monologues by those who'd never been interviewed on TV: caregivers, whistleblowers, migrants, students, survivors. Each clip was 5 minutes long, no cuts, no music, no background noise, just a face and a story. Within days, the platform crashed from demand, and by the following week it had a subscriber base larger than 2 streaming platforms combined. Schools began integrating it into curriculum. Journalists began referencing it as source material. Something in the country had turned.